Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to you, wherever you are. We're recording on Tuesday, February the 16th, and we're delighted to have with us two outstanding guests. More about them in a second. Why the notion of love of Israel during a time of populism? Love of Israel has always been open to the extremes of emotion. Looking back over the last 150 years since the dawn of the first inklings of the Zionist idea, Israel, Zionism, has always drawn tremendous passion out of people. The fights within the Zionist camp are numerous and well documented, and the stuff of folklore. Also, the fights between those who are Zionist and those who are non-Zionist in the Jewish world. And then, of course, the moment you go beyond the Jewish world, also, you see this range of different views as to what's at stake, what's the right path, what's the problem, what's the solution, what's the strategy to get to the solution. And so it's fertile ground to have strong rhetoric, potent populism. And as we try and explore this topic at a time when in the Israeli election cycle, which is an ongoing forever election cycle, and as in the US, you've completed a pretty hot rhetoric time of a discussion in the public culture. Populism is here, it's around, animated by social media, given extra energy by Twitter and the number of characters that you can use to instantly dismiss people. So we found it to be most intriguing to try and have a calm, collected, engaged conversation with two thoughtful people. Hannah Arendt, one of the 20th century's most gifted and insightful theorists, once said about education, education is the point at which we decide whether we love the world enough to assume responsibility for it, and by the same token, save it from that ruin which, except for renewal, except for the coming of the new and the young, would be inevitable. And education, too, is where we decide whether we love our children enough not to expel them from our world and leave them to their own devices, nor to strike from their hands their chance of undertaking something new, something unforeseen by us, but to prepare them in advance for the task of renewing a common world. It's in that spirit that I'm delighted to welcome two dear friends and colleagues. Pnina Agenyahu, she's probably the poster child for smashing through glass ceilings. She directed Hillel at Tel Aviv University. She was a senior shlicha in the Washington, D.C. area for the Jewish Agency based at the Federation. And most recently, in fact, just today, she has assumed the directorship of the partnership program, the 46 twinned communities between Israeli communities and Jewish communities around the world for the Jewish Agency. She made Aliyah from Ethiopia. Welcome, Pnina. And John, dear friend John Levisohn, one of the preeminent philosophers of Jewish education in the last generation. He's based at Brandeis University, where he directs the Mandel Institute for Studies in Jewish Education, and he is a philosopher of Jewish education, the Mandel philosopher of Jewish education, written several books. You can find out more about him on our website and on his own website. I was remembering that one of John's articles is about patriotism juxtaposed with history, and whether we're interested in developing junior patriots or young historians. What do we prefer? And if so, why do we prefer one as opposed to the other? And he's the go-to person if you want to try and pass a complex educational issue. And we invited him to the conference in which he gave a keynote presentation, which forms the basis of this conversation that we're going to have now. So welcome, Pnina. Welcome, John. I'd like to start with the first question. Manishma, in classic terms, Pnina, how are you? You're coming to this salon in the midst of numerous things. With what spirit are you turning up this evening?
As Manishma, it sounds like a simple question, but it's a big question right now. Through the transition of a new position, even though we are in the same organization, it's still exciting, and it's a new word that I need to learn and observe. But personally, I have to say honestly that I'm happy that today the kids went to school after 3 weeks or 4 weeks at home. Can right? Who's counting? But it was even great. It was even great for them. They were like happy to see friends, and all of a sudden you realize how much the social interaction was so important for them. And one of the fun things that a minute before I joined the conversation was that my son started singing a song for Purim, and he asked us if we know the song Misha Nichnas Adar. I was like, oh, he finally changed the disc, as we say. He was singing Hanukkah songs until today, because we skipped Tu Bishvat, we skipped the Hadar, and we jumped right away to Purim. So for all those reasons, today it's for me it's an exciting day. It's full of new things. Going back to school, it's new for the kids as well after a couple of weeks, and being in the new office today, in a new position. As tov, I mean, it's a happy day. If you say if you ask me manishma, I'm in good today.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. I remember when our kids were a little younger than they are now, the two boys were fond of saying, it works in Hebrew. I'll translate it after. Misha nichnas hadar marbitz besimcha. At the start of Adar, the Hebrew month of Adar, you can hit each other with joy. So, John, how are you? Manishma.
Thank you. Physically, I'm fine. My family's fine. My son, my youngest child, who's in Israel now, is very, very happy to be out of Segar and went to visit a friend up in the north, and which is obviously a big thing, and all of that is great. And I feel like I am sort of floating along the top of a sea of suffering and turmoil. And it's a odd disconnect for me to feel like this year, basically, my life has been stable. I'm able to to do my work, to sit at my computer. And I just know that for so many people, that's not the case. Because of the pandemic, because of the economy, because of the threat to our democracy here in the United States, and that's hard. So when I said to a friend of mine, I was trying to explain this to a friend of mine, she said, physically, you're fine, but spiritually not so much. I said, right, spiritually I'm a mess. So, but it's good to be with people who are doing good work and thinking about important things. And for me, that has actually been the most redemptive thing in this year, is to find those moments when I feel like I'm actually able to connect with people to do important work.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome. So I want to start at the place where you fall in love. There's always been an argument whether falling in love is really a Christian concept, because obviously you were, as a priest, meant to preserve sexual chastity, and that if you fell in love, you literally fell. You fell from the high watermark. And so it's not a particularly Jewish concept, which has always encouraged fidelity in relationships to build stable homes. But nonetheless, what caused you to fall in love with Israel? What does it feel like to be in love with a people, with a place? And how did your love for Israel mature over time? John, please.
So it's an interesting question. I mean, not to give away too much, Jonny, you asked us this question in advance to give us a little bit of time to think about it, but I had a hard time saying, well, this was the moment when something significant happened. But I did think about two things. I thought about the people with whom I experienced Israel in various ways. So I thought about my first trip to Israel with my grandparents in the summer of 1982, before my bar mitzvah. And I thought about my the following summer when I was in Israel with my family, and a couple of years later when I was with a group from my summer camp, and a couple of years after that when I was in Israel for a few years in yeshiva with a very close chevra, and thinking about the way that experience of Israel was always, I don't know, mediated through or combined with those important relationships of experiencing something together. And at the same time, the second thought that occurred to me, and it feels like it's a contradiction, but I don't think it is, the moments in being in Israel, experiencing Israel of independence, of increasing my own sense of independence, whether that meant, taking a bus someplace on my own, or walking through the streets of the old city in Jerusalem on my own and kind of navigating the space, or the point at which I felt comfortable enough in my Hebrew to engage with Israelis on my own. Each of those kind of steps of independence also feels very, very significant as part of sort of becoming an adult, becoming comfortable in the world, and in that particular location of the world. So for me, that's how I think about those sequence events. Not so much one time, but those sequences. That's
great. That's great. Love the idea that you become mature in Israel. That's yeah. Pnina, starting from a very different place, not from the northeastern shores of America, but somewhere else. What was it like for you to fall in love with Israel, the people and the place, and how has it changed over time?
So I think for me, it was like 3 times that I fall in love in different way. The first time was very instant way through the vision of my mother, who made the choice to make Aliyah and come to Israel when she was only, I believe, 28 years old, a young woman, younger than I am today, with 2 little girls. I was 3 years old and my oldest was 7. And, without even thinking about how hard it's going to be, without even understanding what is Zionism, and without knowing what is Israel really, for real. Because for her, it was Jerusalem, and it was, a very pure and very instant vision of Yerushalayim, Eretz Zavat, Chalav Udvat, like what they knew from the Bible. And that's, by the way, what she thought. She thought she will end up in a country where all the people are Jewish, all Jewish people will hug her, welcome her, and milk and honey spread all over the country. And that's kind of the vision she told us, she shared with us as kids, as childs. And even though we end up not in Jerusalem, we end up in Ma'alot in the first 3 years, still from Ma'alot, we were still like yearning for Jerusalem. We were waiting. For me, like Jerusalem was always a big story. Even being in Israel and knowing that you're in Ma'alot, we never really understood what's the distance. So I would say that the love was very pure and instant love without understanding what you really love in. Like we didn't understand that it's a complicated love that include the people, the policy, the country, and everything. It was only loving, the country that it is because it was a promised country for the Jewish people, and we were part of the Jewish people. And we just love the people of Israel because they are Jewish and we are Jewish. We never thought that it will be as I grew up and I understood it, it's more complicated, right? So I think that's one type of love that as a child, I grew up with this very concept, with this the instant concept of everyone should love each other as a Jews, because we're all Jews. And we all Israelis, and we all love Israel as it is. I didn't see problems, I didn't see the complexity. The other time I fell in love was when I was a shlicha to Australia many years ago through the Zionist seminars, and being there in Mount Scopus school every day with teens that was so passionate about Israel, even though they never been in Israel. I was amazed to see how they are. They always was curious to hear from me. My daily life in Israel and how Israel look like, and if it's really like what they see in the news and what they observe in their youth movement and school. And they were like all of them were waiting for the gap year to come to Israel, and I couldn't understand. Australia, it was hours away from Israel. Like the distance is huge. Why not dreaming about America or Japan, and Thailand? They're all always dreaming about Israel and coming, and it's a different generation. It wasn't the generation, of my parents, and it wasn't the same love to Israel. It wasn't like instant love. It was a love that they saw the complexity, and that the same summer, I think it was also the disengagement from Gaza Strip the same year that I was there, it's happened in Israel. And it was hard for us, the Shlichim, by the way, to be there. Well, many people of our friends in Israel are either fighting in the army or either needed a force to leave their houses. So we could understand how they see those news, and they still love Israel. Many of the kids we met, that was the second time. And it's part of the growth that I feel I have with my love to Israel. And the third time also, I think, happened on the Shlichut, my shlichut in Washington. I think it was the first year or the second year when the protected age operation was taken over, and something really break down for me. I was really broken. It was hard for me to be away when something like that happened in Israel. It was really, really hard. I couldn't even there was a point where the executive director of the federation told me, Pnina, if you feel like you need to go home now to be in Israel, we support that. You can go, leave everything out, because it was so hard. And that was a moment when I understood that from out of this pain that I felt, that I really love my country. With all this pain, something was very strong about the love. I don't know if it's to call it falling in love again, but I just felt like it's like when you love someone and you feel that you're really far away from, and it's so painful. That's what I felt. And it wasn't about one person or my family. It was about the entire, country and the people that I even didn't know who they are. But something happened in there, and even now, when speaking about it, I'm very emotional. It was so hard, it was so painful for me to be there. So for me, there's like 3 points really demonstrate, the love that I still have with all the complexity, and it's not easy. I mean, the connection to Israel not easy for me as a person, as a person of color, as an Ethiopian, as a woman. It's not easy, but I love that country. I don't know, to put all of that together.
So thank you, and I want to push you both onwards a bit now to say, you used the phrase milk and honey, land flowing with milk and honey. Well, as educators, we're always keen to try and look one step beyond, one step behind. So what would be behind milk? Cows. What would be behind honey? Bees. What do cows do? They stink. What do bees do? They sting. So I want to ask you, what has been stinky for you about Israel? What has been stingy for you about Israel? What has alienated you from Israel, Israelis, Israeli policy over time? Why have these things been so alienating for you? Did you ever fall out of love? And if so, why? And if not, why did you not fall out of love when it was sometimes so painful, and it was stinky and stingy. So Pnina.
Hearing this, the first thing that are coming up to mind now, it's the last protest held in like 2 summers ago, I think 3 summers ago, with the death of Salman Teka, which raised again the news last week. I don't know if you noticed, because they just nominated the same officer that should him to be an officer in a different police station. And I have to say that it was, again, a moment of very painful moment for me, because it was, I don't know if it's stinky, but it stinged the bees part. I love that definition, the bee stuff, because you feel like you tried so much as a community, as an individual, to be part of the nation that you thrive and dreamed about to take part of. And there is kind of an understanding at some point of your life that we made it, right? We are integrated, at least my generation, or hopefully the next generation with my kids. We have Hebrew names, we speak the Hebrew language, we take in lead in different positions in the Israel society. So you don't need to see the skin color, right? You need to see me as part of the Israel society, as an Israeli, as a Jewish person. And all of a sudden, seeing that, and also, I'm a person of data now, so I'm looking at the data and looking at the data of how many police profiling our community was facing, and what the percentage of the youth being sent into jail or having criminal cases opening up for them, in regard to the numbers of our community, it's hard to see that people doesn't see behind who you are and your image. And again, I'm going back to the position of how my mother envisioned and how the leadership of our community envisioned. They envisioned that, first of all, by the way, they thought that all the Jews are black like us, like in the song of Banai. Who knows if Abraham Avinu was black as well, right? But even more than that, we thought that even if people look different, we didn't care. The Ethiopian people, the community, the leadership doesn't care if you're white, if you're in America. They really looked into the halacha and to the Judaism, to the core of being a Jew. That's what they care more about. And all of a sudden, it's upside down. The B part is when we see that around us, people doesn't judge me as being part of a Jewish people or judge me as part of the Israel society. They judge me by how I look like. וזה מאוד קשה לראות, because we hear not just randomly, ולא במקרה, we hear בזכות because we are part of the Jewish people, and after that it was hard to fall in love again, I have to say. After that it's hard because even if I understand the complexity, because I'm swimming in that field so much, and I'm working, in Jewish education, working with Jewish people. For the young generation that was born in Israel, the Ethiopian young generation that born here, they don't see themselves as an Ethiopian. They see themselves first as an Israeli, then maybe Jewish. The Ethiopian identity, it's used to be last. But today they already talking about a different way of identify themselves, and they will look to be more belonging to the Ethiopian community. But what is the Ethiopian community in Israel today, right? I mean, which kind of, in what sense of it is, and how it's look like. So it's actually pushed them back away instead of bring them and embrace them back to the Israel society and to what we call Israel, instead of continuing the love that our parents came with to Israel and make it, understand the complexity maybe and make it a different way of love. They push back that, and it's create more hatred, unfortunately.
Wow, that's very poignant. Thank you so much. John, how do you look at this? What issues?
Pnina, thank you for that, because that was it's really, really helpful for me, I'm sure for all of us, to hear the perspective on even some very, very recent developments, and so thank you. The thing I was thinking about, the kind of the moment of alienation, I don't know, by now it's ancient history, but I was thinking about the beginning of the first Intifada in 1987. I was in yeshiva in Israel, and you know, I mentioned that I had been in, my first trip to Israel had been with my grandparents. That actually was the summer of 1982. Nobody told me, maybe they did and I just forgot, that there was a war going on in Lebanon. So it was sort of just not in my consciousness at all. But in 1987, in the fall of 1987, it sort of exploded into my consciousness, and that there were these political conflicts, and they weren't going away. And I remember very clearly thinking that what was so hard, you use the word alienating, what was so alienating for me at the time was, I mean, I don't think I ever imagined, and I still don't imagine that I have the solution, that I know exactly what Israeli government policy should be with regard to the Palestinians. But what was so hard for me at that time was thinking, this can't be right. It cannot be right that the approach which will to sort of ramp up the levels of violence, that this will succeed in convincing other people not to have the aspirations that they have. So I didn't know what to do about it. I just felt like, but the way that we are talking, and I mean, I and my friends and my teachers in the yeshiva and the political class were talking about it, I just felt like, but this can't work. And the funny thing is, I actually, for a long time, I thought that moment was triggered by my reading of David Grossman's The Yellow Wind. Just a couple of years ago, I realized that's not true. I had somehow invented that because The Yellow Wind was published the following year. So somehow in my mind, I conflated those things. But the idea was, but here's a respected Israeli who's saying there are voices that we need to listen to, and the only way that we're going to resolve this crisis is through the listening, not by setting aside these voices. So that was a moment of alienation. And the thing that really strikes me about that, as I reflect on it, is, I mean, I guess the image of alienation is distancing, but the actual experience that I felt was, I so much wanted in that moment to figure out how to envision a better future for Israel and its neighbors, but in this land, it didn't feel to me like I was separating myself, right? So I think it's okay to call it a moment of alienation, but for me, I didn't experience it as a kind of emotional distancing. It was an emotional engagement, saying like, this is so incredibly painful. And here I just want to name that the pain that I felt in that moment. I don't want to compare it to your experience, Pnina, because I think that there's something that you have shared with us, which is much more raw and personal in a way that mine wasn't, that involved aspects of your identity that mine did not. But there was pain. There was the sense that, like, I want this thing to be better. I want to find a future, to work towards a future that, can make sense for me, and that I didn't see it happening on the ground.
Wow, thank you. Both of these issues that you chose, Pnina and John, are seem to be ongoing, perennial, and somehow baked in to much of what we see happening in the unfolding reality in Israel over time. And then one is somewhat forced to consider, well, what does one do with that educationally? How does one approach? How does one capture both of your answers, both the love as well as the distance, the alienating, the hatred, the uncertainty, the fear, the pain? How does one capture both the love and the pain of the unfolding story of Israel? And here we want to introduce the notion of populism, where we started. So we've got a little straw poll that we'd like everyone to on this call to give their answer to. So can you please display the question? So what is the best way to confront the culture of populism? Here are your options. Make sure that you speak up loud and long and that your voice is left in the arena. Be like Hillel, our rabbinic ancestor. Always quote your opponent's ideas before your own. Third possibility, isolate your foundational opponents, those people who are really going for the heart of your existence, and only converse with the reasonable opposition. Or perhaps four, there's another option that you can think of, and in which case please share it in the chat, or if you've got any comments, then also share in chat. So we'll give you a moment just to fill it in, and then we'll see the wisdom of this group, and then we'll turn to Pnina and John for how to think about it.
A few more seconds and I'm gonna share the poll. Last answers? Okay.
Okay, so there's a clear majority who urges us as educators to be like Hillel. The others do pretty well. So please share in the chat what your other options are and how you wish to go about it. Tiny number for speak up loud and long. So it's clearly the big number goes for Hillel. So there's obviously many ways of defining populism, and we don't have to necessarily spend our time dwelling on the precision of that. Sound bites, the Twitter sphere, they do not amplify nuance and sophistication. They do not capture the kinds of responses that you just both gave to previous questions that I asked. You're two sophisticated educators that started life in very different parts of the world and have traveled different routes personally and professionally. And that's why we wanted to bring you together. But I'm turning to you and saying, help, help. How do we handle the search for both sanity and for integrity in the midst of this loud, populist, binary rhetoric? John, Mr. Philosopher, help.
Well, I didn't know that the poll was coming, but that was an interesting way of framing things around Hillel. One of my teachers, Hilary Putnam, a great philosopher, taught me many things, but I think more than any of the kind of content of the philosophy that I learned from him was a style of doing philosophy. I can still picture him saying about some other idea that he was about to disagree with, recounting that idea and saying something like, now there's something right about this, right? There's something right about this idea that we knew where he was going. He was about to tell us why it was wrong, but he started up by saying there's something right about this. And I think that that's an incredibly valuable stance, not just to share, as in the Hillel quote, but but also to really work hard to see what the element of insight or wisdom or possibly even truth is. You know, if there's one thing for me that that I wish I could kind of eradicate, it would be zero-sum thinking. Like there are moments in our life when we have, we have a budget, and if we're going to spend it on this, we can't spend it on that. But in almost every other area of our life, there is, dividing the world into us and them, and imagining that conceding a point to the opponent is necessarily to lose ground. I just don't think that's how sophisticated thinkers or passionate people ought to behave in the world, ought to live in the world. So that's at a more conceptual level. On a practical level, the one other thought I have is how fundamental it is to build trust, and how it's funny, we're in a group of, I don't know, the 40 people on the call, and I don't know, people might listen to this and tweet out a soundbite, and I don't know, we'll get stabbed in the back by somebody, but at the moment, at least, I'm experiencing trust with people, and I'm assuming that others do too. And in educational settings, it seems to me that has to be the building block. We have to start with small enough groups where people can get to know each other and can learn that they can be just a little bit vulnerable with each other, and to develop those environments of trust. I don't think we're doing a very good job about that. I don't think whether it comes to Israel or other areas, it's not a very efficient solution to say that, in several hundred million people in America should all break down into groups of 10. I don't think that's, and 7 or 8 million people in Israel should all break down into groups of 10 and start from there. I don't think that's very efficient, but it may actually be what we need.
That's beautiful. Yeah, there's a book written by a South African political scientist, a Jewish guy, Levisohn, who spent time in Israel, was in Sahel and so on, then was in Britain for a while. Anyway, he's a professor in Hawaii now. He's written a book called Primal, I think it's called Primal Quest, something, or Future Primal, something like that. And one of the key ideas that he has there from his research into how does human society develop is the centrality of the circle in the origins of humanity, that those African peoples sitting around a circle and the participatory democracy of that circle. And in many ways, that was the same as the kfutsa that we had in summer camps, youth movements, however, whatever image you bring to mind. You think about the origins of the kibbutz movement and how that developed. The notion of minyan in prayer, it was this intimate setting where you could have genuine, full-fledged, face-to-face relationships, and that people acknowledged if you were there, and they recognized when you were not there. And what does that do for your own sense of self-worth and self-esteem? So thank you, John. Pnina, what's your way of dealing with this?
I'm so happy that John actually finished with trust, because I was thinking through all my, at least, professional experience. In the end of the day, what we try to do as shlichim, for many different times there was a shlicha, and also through what we're doing in the partnership, it's creating connection, right? Creating those people-to-people connection and building, but it can be built up without the trust that you just mentioned, John. I mean, if just creating a safe space, which is also important, just creating the links to create this connection, which is also important, is exist without the trust we're building before that. It's another layer that it's so important. And I have to say that it's also something that I unfortunately experienced that internally in this real society. There is a lack of trust between the people here. And it's not about, people, it's easier to talk about how we lose trust to our leadership in the government, and how we lose trust in the institution like the police authority, right? Which is exist, and it's important fight to fight as well, to to protest. But I think the biggest trust we're losing right now is between each other as people. So when we hold in a conversation about love to Israel, or conversation about what's really important and significant about being part of the Israeli society, and what's significant in creating this connection of people to people. If it's a shaliach going to a community, you have to build this trust before that. If you want them to listen, and you want them to open their mind and their hearts. And I remember that one of the things that we launched when I was working for as a Hillel director at Tel Aviv, and maybe Osna remember that back then. One of the things that we created nationally, it's a program that we call it the Jewish Story. And what we ask, every individual is to share his Jewish story. And always, the method was not to tell us the Jewish stories, hasipu beheredia. It's not about, the big moment of I traveled to South America and I had a kiddush for the first time as a secular. We're not looking for those stories. We're looking for those, those individual, personal, simple stories. That's what will build up the trust between each other. Because when you share a moment like that, you open your heart, you open the mind, and the other side listen to you, open their minds, and being able to embrace you as well. And we're missing that. We don't have that, unfortunately, not here. And I think also, when I see tweets and some comments on Facebook when something happened in Israel, and colleagues outside of Israel respond because they care, not because they don't care. They're not indifferent about what's happening here. But sometimes, the response is based on why they just read, if it's, the media and what's being shared on the social media, and not necessarily picking up pick up the phone, call me, because you know me. I serve in your community for 4 years, and some of the members do that. You call me and ask me what's going on, what's happening there. And when you hear that, you build in a different way of understanding and connection, which is much, much deeper. And it's much more, how we say that, זה יותר משמעותי להמשך. It can continue for a long term of relationship, and it's not like one time of relationship. And we're missing that internally, like inside the Israeli society, I feel. And a bit also when we look in, the global Jewish people, when we look around us. And trust is an important thing, besides like creating this connection. It's something we need to work on.
Thank you. Thank you. One of the favorite questions I've had in the last 20 years of my educational work has been to ask people to write down on a piece of paper, draw on a piece of paper, the conversational circle of their intimates. Who are those people with whom they have an intimate conversation? And it's just astonishing whether they are Israeli, American, British, whatever, the extent to which people are basically in a conversation with people who look at the world like they do. And it's very prominent in Israeli society at the moment, probably elsewhere too, but very much so. John, you wrote in the keynote that you gave, which is now forms the basis for an article in this book, of the need to move from a notion of love to a notion of hope in Israel education, because it's more suggestive, perhaps. What's your thinking there, and what gives you cause for hope in the Israeli project? And what would be a signature project that each of you would like to say, if we could only do this, it would bring tangible hope about Israel to the next generation, whether the next generation are Israelis or Jews around the world, wherever. Pnina, please.
I believe if we have, I don't know, I don't remember if we spoke about it once with you or others professional, but if we have something to dream about together as people, it will bring, I think, the hope that will fulfill us to something to look forward in the future. Like I remember, like one of the GAs in the past was one people, one destiny, right? And there's always those branding, and I feel like when we established the state of Israel, we had a mission together as a people. And it was something that gave us the hope, no matter where you are, each person somewhere in the world had his own role into it. And at least from my understanding and the way that I experience, we don't have something like that to get today to bring us together, that we feel that we have the role to contribute into it. And maybe if we create a sense of what is it, and there is some words like, Jewish peoplehood, there is some trends of, the global Jewish people. There is conversation about what can be that hope, but I don't think it's sufficient enough that bring the young generation, the white generation, the different types, the different generation groups that we have today to think together what can enable us as a people. And once it was tikkun olam, each time there is something else. But now I feel like there is something that need to bring us together to provide us sheyeh mashu mamashi, something that really you can feel and understand that you're taking part of it to continue this hope together. ויכול להיות, maybe, one of it is, and I may, מה קורה למילים שלי? מגזימה, maybe I'm
exaggerate,
thank you. But maybe, one of the things that can give us hope, it's create, and again, I'm trying to be careful with the wordings because I don't want anyone, John, to tweet me like that. I already had that happen in the past. But maybe the hope is to think together how we create in חברה מתוקנת. When we look at,
an exemplary society or something like that.
Yeah,
חברה מופת.
בדיוק, חברה מופת.
A repaired society.
When it's not about being all a goyim. It's not about that. It's about, looking internally on what is this חברה, what is this community that I'm taking part of, that I always care about. I'm always emotional when something happens. I always vocal about it. And I want to be also proactive about it. I don't want to be indifferent. I don't want to, sit on the line. And I don't know if I can say right now what it is, but I think, but especially now, like, I'm working on, there's one thing that I'm working on in creating, a new way of partnership, which is around thematic partnership globally. And it's divided to group. And in conversation that I'm handling now, one is the LGBTQ community, Jewish LGBTQ leaders, and one it's Jews of color leaders. And it's interesting to see that both of them, even they both different words, they are both struggling with identity within the Jewish people. זאת אומרת, like the LGBTQ community always struggle with the gender and their, that, and the theological
Religion.
part, the religion and gender, right? And with the Jews of colors, it's about ethnicity, racial, and and the religious as well. וזה מעניין because among themselves, there's also a big diversity. So how you create a sense when, everyone is proactive and everyone is having a hope that they are, willing to be part of this community, these people, understanding that they have their own uniqueness without, taking off their uniqueness. So, בלי חיבוק חם מדי, חיבוק דוב, as we say in Hebrew, not like a bear hug. It's the same in English, but they all hugs because we all part in the same family, right? But each of them also need to stay uniqueness. So I don't know if I have the right definition right now, but
that's fine. That's great because you're in the right position to be able to come up with something and then run ahead and make it happen. So we'll check back in with you in a couple of years' time and make sure that you're on track. John, you articulated the need for hope. So how do you look at this and what would you do?
When I was writing there, I was thinking about the way that I was encountering more and more voices that I felt were hopeless, and hadn't actually sort of internalized that this belief, the faith that everything's going to turn out okay, that there's no guarantee that everything's going to turn out okay, and I was starting to hear those voices and starting to think that, have we really processed what that means? That there is no guarantee, but for me, what that means educationally is that we have to turn hope into kind of an educational objective. We have to work at it. We have to name it and say, like, our job is to actually to be hopeful and to encourage hope for others. And again, not because, well, if you're just hopeful, then everything is going to work out okay. There's no guarantee. The only thing that we know, I would argue, the only thing that we actually know is that being hopeful is a better way to live. And that if you're faced with that option of, am I going to, if I can work my way through to hope as opposed to despair, that's a better way to live. There are many things that give me hope in Israel that kind of lift me up. I'm thinking, actually, the first thing that comes to mind are aspects of Israeli culture. I'm thinking about putting Eden Elena on my on my cycle and on YouTube, or Ewa, or Dana Mehdi, or other pop artists that I love listening to in the background, that kind of fill me up with hope for Israel and for its future. The one thing, if I could be very, very practical here, the one thing that I actually think would make a huge difference, if we could somehow figure out the political will to do it, would be to, for the first time, to really seriously invest in Ivrit, in a culture, an entire ecosystem of supporting the study of Hebrew in the Jewish diaspora. We've never really invested in this. We'll spend a little bit on a curriculum here, a little bit there, or we'll give one person a fellow. We've never invested in the way that we ought to, if we were to take this seriously as a national project that everybody could have access to. And then we complain about, it's so terrible that American Jews in particular don't know Hebrew. But I think and I'm not speaking obviously to anybody on the call here, but I think in terms of our collective responsibility, I think there's so much more that we could do, and frankly, it ought to be led by the government of the state as kind of a project for the future of the Jewish people.
Wonderful. So our time is nearly up. So the last question is I'm gonna ask you for one sentence answers. Who's the thinker or the text that you recommend to everyone to read in order to realize your best hopes for what Israel is, what Israel education can be? John?
So hard, but one sentence, I think I will say Shimon Ravidovich, who was a Zionist scholar of Jewish studies, chair of my department way before I got to Brandeis, who articulated a vision of cultural Zionism in which the diaspora played not just an incidental role, the way maybe in Ahad Ha'am it did, but an essential role. So he was a cultural Zionist, an unabashed Zionist, but for whom Zionism, the diaspora played an essential role.
Wonderful. For those of you who are regulars, that's the second time you've heard that recommendation. You heard it last week or 2 weeks ago too. So it's great. Thank you. Pnina.
The person that came in mind is actually Avram Infeld, and not only because his legacy and what he left behind, but also because we actually start to kind of together professionally. at least for me, from my point of view, as just a student in Hillel in Jerusalem years ago, and he just started being the president of Hillel International. There was a cue that we both start together professionally in that ward. I mean, he of course getting a lot of experience than me, but what did capture me is his vision of seeing the people, having the love and the passion about Israel, and he always have hope in his eyes, no matter what. Like when he speak about Israel, when he speak about Jewish people, וזה מדליק אותך, it's inspire you, no matter what happening. At least me, it's inspired me the entire time as a professional in the Hillel, and also inspired me afterward as president of the Jewish Agency, to hear him, to see him, to even take some of his legs of the table, the 5 legs of the table. But as a person, as a thinker, as a true Zionist, and as Ole himself, we both also share experience of Olim Chadashim, even though we come from different places and different culture. What's funny about it, he always told me that we both came from Africa, even though we don't look the same, right? But there is something about that as well. So Ava Midfeld.
Thank you. So I want to thank both of you. I think I've taken for the last several years to defining education as a profession of hope. I can't really think about what education is about unless it's about hope. And Paulo Freire, the educational theorist, wrote about the pedagogy of hope. And I've been thinking for a long time now, we need to develop a much more elaborate, sophisticated Jewish educational pedagogy of hope. I'm not yet sure what that looks like, but both hope and education are about the process of human becoming. That we're not there yet. There is more yet to do. And the best definition I have of what a hope is a dream that's accepted the responsibility to become reality. A hope is a dream that's accepted the responsibility to become reality. And it seems to me that education and educators are those people who are going to be able to cultivate the wellsprings that make that in some way possible. So thank you. Thank you so much. Please, everyone, take the time to answer the survey. Thank you for all your comments in chat. We do read them and we do value them. As always, this recording will be available as podcast within the next 10 days. So you can share it with those people who you wished would have been here. We'll be together again in 2 weeks' time when we'll be exploring feeling at home in the homeland, even when you're the minority. So we'll have an Israeli Arab Palestinian speaker, Dr. Nasrin Shahada, together with Rabbi Dr. Elliot Cosgrove, the New York conservative rabbi, both of whom are in some ways minorities in this place. So what is it for them to feel at home here? So thank you, Pnina. Good luck in your position. Thank you, John. Good luck on your next writing project. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Back to you, Osnat.